In early 2006, a 38-year-old cowboy from Wyoming vanishes. Throughout the 2 decades that Roy Vavra has been missing, one person confesses to his murder, and another convicted murderer heavily implies that he knows more about the investigation than he had originally let on. Still to this day, his case has remained unsolved. Hi everyone, and welcome back to Vanished Memories, a channel dedicated to getting out lesser-known true crime and missing persons cases. Today, I'll be sharing with you the case of 38-year-old cowboy Roy Vavra, who went missing from his home in Gillette, Wyoming on January 24th, 2006. Roy's case, like many of the other cases that I have covered, did not get as much attention as it should have, but in the recent few months, it actually has had a resurgence in coverage. That's because cold case detectives have looked back into his case and are trying to push for more media attention about it. Before I get into his case, if you are interested in this type of content, please do subscribe as I put out new videos every Wednesday. Before I fully delve into this case though, I do just want to give a content warning. In today's case, I will be talking about violence against women, as well as the intimidation with and use of a firearm. Viewer discretion is, of course, advised. Roy Vavra and his twin sister Ann were born in Alaska to a 40-year-old mother who was unfortunately unable to take care of them. She already had several small children within her home, and due to having a hard time keeping up with just those children, she chose to put her twins up for adoption. However, it didn't take long for Roy and Ann to be adopted by a couple living in Fairbanks, Alaska, that couple being named Louis and Barbara Vavra. Thus, Roy and Ann became Roy Vavra and Ann Vavra. The family would soon move to the continental U.S. in Laramie, Wyoming, when Louis had accepted a job offer at the University of Wyoming. The home that Roy and Ann were raised in sat on 2 acres, allowing them a lot of space and room to grow in their childhood. However, Roy and Ann were actually provided with even more room, as they would spend a lot of time, especially in the summer, at Barbara's family home, which was in South Dakota. This was a ranch that sat on 50,000 acres, owned by their grandfather, Roy Houck. Roy Houck was not only at one point the state senator for South Dakota and also the lieutenant governor, but Roy also was known as a very prolific rancher. He would raise both cattle and bison on his immense property. With that being said, in taking after their grandfather, both Roy and Ann took an immediate liking to the rodeo scene. They would learn valuable skills from a young age, leading them to become ropers who traveled west on the rodeo circuit. A roper, if you don't know, is someone who uses a lasso or a rope of some sort to catch livestock. Specifically, a lot of the times it's cattle. In rodeos, a roper would compete against others in timed events, often earning prizes like cash rewards, custom belt buckles, or other gear. Besides the rodeo that he enjoyed sharing with his sister Ann, Roy also loved to train and trade horses. In addition, he was a very skilled and prolific hunter as well as fisherman. Roy often would take hunting and fishing trips and had successfully hunted down animals like bears and mountain lions. Be aware that if you do your own research on this case, you might actually find a few pictures of him with those dead animals. I've chosen not to show it due to the nature of them, but just be aware that you might find those pictures yourself. In addition to Roy's knack for hunting and fishing and just being an all-around cowboy, I also found out another very interesting fact about him. In 1989, filming would begin for the Kevin Costner movie Dancing with Wolves. One of the filming locations was actually set on Roy's grandfather's ranch, that 50,000 acre ranch that we talked about earlier. This would actually lead Roy to be cast in the movie as an extra, and he played one of the cavalry in one of the background scenes. You'll be seeing some of Roy's pictures in that movie on screen now. Kevin Costner not only directed the film, but also played as an actor in the film. And at one point, as he was filming down there, he needed to borrow someone's truck, and Roy volunteered his truck up for Kevin to use. In return, as thanks, Kevin would gift him a 6-CD stereo changer for his truck, which it said that Roy valued very much. I thought that this was a really interesting tidbit to share. A lot of times when I research cases, it's actually really hard to find information about who these people were in life or were before they went missing, and it's so cool to get to actually learn about someone who did something kind of out of the norm. I mean, how many people can say that they were cast in a Kevin Costner movie? It's just really cool to be able to learn about someone And Roy seemed like such an interesting person who had so many valuable things to just give to the world. All in all, Roy Vavra was described as being the all-around typical cowboy, and he made his money mending fences and doing ranch work. But according to his own twin sister Anne, Roy did have one big weakness, and that was women. Roy was known to be quite the charming ladies' man, and with that status came some questionable choices. It was said that Roy sometimes did blur the line between relationships that he had with women who already had partners, such as boyfriends or husbands. Keep this in mind for the theories that we'll go into later. With that being said, now that we know a little bit about Roy and who he was in life and before he went missing, let's get into a little bit more about how he was acting leading up to his disappearance. Sometime around late 2005 or early 2006, Roy had actually sold his small ranchette to a friend of his. This was a female friend who would end up actually becoming his roommate, as it was known that Roy was still living in the home even though he had already sold it. It's not entirely certain or clear why he had chosen to do this, but I'm assuming he was likely looking for other housing in the meantime between selling his house and getting another place. At this time in Roy's life, Anne would recall that he was becoming a lot more distant, not only with her, but also the rest of his family. Typically, in past years, Roy would make the 4 or so hour drive to visit his family during the holidays. But when it came to Thanksgiving and Christmas of 2005, Roy was nowhere to be found. It seems that he kind of just didn't show up and never bothered to tell anyone that he wasn't coming. At this point in Roy's life, too, his cell phone was actually turned off, and because of that, Anne would need to call him at his residence and track him down on the landline in order to actually communicate with him, even though she had been trying to for months at this point. It's not entirely clear how long Ray was basically unreachable, but we do know that on January 23rd of 2006, Anne would have her last cell phone conversation with him. This conversation would be something that Anne would recall being pretty uncharacteristic for him. Anne would describe that Roy just seemed different on the phone. Basically, he was giving her short answers, kind of just wasn't responding to her, and seemed all around grumpy in her own words. He eventually would tell her that he was tired, and as such, she wouldn't push too much and would just end the phone call. But that, unfortunately, would be the last time that she would ever hear from her twin brother again. On the next day, Tuesday, January 24th of 2006, Roy's roommate would leave the home at around 6 a.m. This would be the last confirmed sighting of Roy. On that Tuesday, Roy had already made preset plans to go on a hunting trip with his longtime friend, Seth Long. As such, Seth started to get ready for the day, and at around 10:30 a.m., he would leave his home with his children in order to drop them off at daycare. This route would mean that he would have to pass Roy's house, and while passing, he would notice an unfamiliar white flatbed truck in Roy's driveway. This was later described as being something like a Ford Courier, so I will have a picture of that on screen, but be aware that it's not exactly known what model or what year this vehicle was. Seth didn't really think much of it and assumed he just had a random visitor, and would continue on his way to go drop his children off at daycare. But by the time Seth drove back to Roy's house, which would have been around 11 a.m., which was their previously agreed upon meeting time, Roy was nowhere to be found. Obviously, this would have been very uncharacteristic of Roy. It seems that when he made plans, he pretty much stuck to them, but we do know that as of recently, he had become a lot more flaky and distant, and just in general hard to get a hold of. So it seems Seth didn't really think much of this. From what I could tell, though, it seems that Seth did enter Roy's home, likely just to see if Roy was there and just not responding to his knocks on the door. This likely was an action that Seth didn't really think twice about. I mean, him and Roy were longtime friends, so it makes sense for Seth to have just popped in to make sure that everything was okay and see if Roy was still in there. But what Seth found was a little bit confusing. Seth would walk into the home and find on the counter that Roy had left a note. This note had stated that Roy would be back to the home by Seth and his agreed upon time, which was 11 a.m. But as we know, it was already 11 a.m. and Roy was nowhere to be found. Roy's truck was still in the driveway, his dog was still at home, and along with the note that was signed by him on the counter, he also left his wallet, keys, checkbook, and other personal belongings. I'm not exactly sure if his phone was still there, like his cell phone, but again, I know that it was turned off, so I'm not sure if he ever turned it back on or if he was still using it, or what happened with the phone. It really isn't very clear if there was a phone found at all. So Seth likely waited for Roy for a little bit to see if he would come back just a little bit late, but when Roy didn't show up, Seth just left the home. Later that day, Roy's roommate would return home, likely seeing that his truck was still in the driveway, his dog was still there, and all of his belongings were still there, along with that note. But again, Roy never showed up, so it seems that the roommate was just kind of waiting it out and hoping that he would return. However, when he didn't a few days later, she was the one that filed a missing persons report. Now, I do just want to mention here that I know that it could be kind of a red flag for some people that the family weren't the one to report him missing, but you have to remember that Roy had become increasingly distant, so this period of silence from him probably wasn't all that abnormal for the recent past. And with that being said, once the police report was filed, an investigation would start. So let's get into the investigation on the disappearance of Roy Vavra. Now, the investigation, according to a lot of sources, was done pretty promptly, but what I found interesting was that there really wasn't that much media coverage in his case, like I mentioned in the intro to this video. At the time of this case, there really was only one paper in Gillette, Wyoming that reported on Roy's disappearance. And I found this really interesting. Now, we know that there are so many cases of missing persons just not getting coverage that they need to. That's pretty much why I've made this channel. But what I found interesting was that Roy doesn't really fit into those normal parameters for those type of missing persons. Roy Vavra is such an interesting case in its lack of coverage. We have to remember that both Roy and his sister Anne were very well known in the Western rodeo. Additionally, Roy was a very talented roper and was very well known in his area from all accounts that I was able to find. His grandfather was a pretty well known or prominent person in South Dakota, with being the former state senator, and was pretty well known himself. And even to the point that his ranch was used in a pretty famous movie that would go on to win 7 Academy Awards. This movie, Roy was even an extra in. It's honestly kind of shocking to me that with the prominence of especially Roy's grandfather, even though Roy's grandfather was deceased at the time, that there wasn't some type of headlines that said something like, former state senator's grandson goes missing, or famous roper goes missing. There just wasn't that coverage. And I'm not at all saying that there's cases that deserve more coverage than others. That's not at all what I'm trying to imply. But it just surprises me that the media didn't run with that, if that makes sense. But I just wanted to mention that. I just thought it was kind of an interesting dichotomy to the other cases that I cover. But regardless of that, let's get into the investigation of Roy's disappearance. In response to the report of Roy being missing, the Campbell County Sheriff's Office were the one to handle the case. The first and really only initial thing that came out was an alleged sighting of Roy at the time. According to a witness that is unnamed, they had seen Roy leaving a convenience store located on Highway 50 and Force Road. From what I'm able to tell on Google Maps, which I will have a picture of right now, this convenience store was called the Little Store, but I'm not entirely sure since it wasn't named, though it seems to fit the exact placement where Roy would have been that day. Roy, according to this witness, had left the Little Store, or whatever convenience store it was, that day with an unknown white male. This white male was described as being in his 30s and having short blonde hair. They would leave in a small white pickup truck, just like Seth had seen in Roy's driveway, and then drive off. In the initial reports of this case, which again there were so few, but in those initial reports, this witness statement was basically reported as fact. To this day, it's still on Roy's NamUs profile, as well as the Wyoming State Missing Persons database. However, in a news segment that came out just a few months ago, the cold case detective that's reopened the case has since said that this statement was false, and basically to disregard that information. So I'm not exactly sure why this witness statement was thrown out, or even when it was exactly thrown out, but I just wanted to mention that. Basically, even though this white truck seemed to fit the description of the white truck that Seth had seen in Roy's driveway, it seems that whoever had reported this information was not exactly trustworthy. So take that sighting with a grain of salt, but I just wanted to report that to you. Like I just mentioned, this alleged sighting was basically the only tidbit of information that we would get for years in Roy's case. However, that doesn't mean that both law enforcement and Roy's family and friends weren't trying to get some answers as to what happened to Roy or where he could be. Throughout the first few years of Roy's disappearance, his family and friends would host Roping for Roy events. These were events where any proceeds that they would make from it, and I believe that they were rodeo-style events, they would put into a reward fund for any information that could lead to answers in Roy's case or lead to Roy's whereabouts. Additionally, 2 years into his disappearance in 2008, his friend Sherry Ann Taylor would release a song about him and about her processing her grief on losing him in that way. I will try to include a clip of that song in this. Hopefully I don't get copyrighted, but if not, I will attempt to link it down in the description box below if you feel inclined to listen to it. It is a very beautiful song.
The day when Roy just went and flew away, like you drifted away in a bright neon morning with pink and blue in the sky. Felt the warm wind blowing through the hills of
Recently, there's been a lot more information about what actually the investigation originally entailed when it kicked off in 2006. If you recall, the only information that we ever had really gotten was that alleged, now debunked, witness statement about Roy leaving a convenience store with a man in a white truck. But there was definitely more going on in the background of the investigation that the media and the public just weren't able to see. And that was that there were several interviews being conducted with people in Roy's life. These interviews would eventually all fall into one main suspect, and that was a man named Troy Dowd. Now, I know Roy and Troy are going to be confusing, so I'll try my best to say it very clearly and hopefully not misspeak, but sorry if anything gets a little bit misconstrued. Troy Dowd is someone that we need to take a little bit of a pause on Roy's story to really look into. In 2006, Troy would have been 40 years old, just 2 years Roy's senior, and was living across the street from him, so he was Roy's neighbor. But Troy Dowd had a very violent past. In March of 1991, Troy and his ex-wife would end their 6-year marriage. As a result, his ex-wife and his daughter would leave the home and move out to another location. For some reason, Troy was granted primary custody, or at least had primary custody in some capacity, to their daughter, and because of this, Troy's ex-wife would only be able to get their daughter every other weekend. But on a weekend in April, due to a snowstorm, Troy's ex-wife was unable to pick up their daughter. The ex-wife would call to let him know this, and Troy seemed initially fine with the arrangement. Obviously, there really wasn't anything that either of them can do with the driving conditions that were happening at the time. But by the end of that weekend, when Troy's ex-wife actually would be able to make it to grab their daughter, unfortunately, Troy's attitude had completely shifted. Troy would become completely enraged when he realized that his ex-wife was driving a vehicle that belonged to a friend of a person that she used to be romantically involved with. This anger would eventually culminate into him holding her at gunpoint, kidnapping her, and beating her before she eventually was able to escape. As a result of this ordeal, Troy was charged with felony aggravated kidnapping and assault and battery. But while awaiting sentencing after a jury had found him guilty, Troy decided to skip bail and instead flee to Florida. While there, Troy also managed to rack up another charge, apparently being charged and convicted of stealing 14 quarter horses from a woman in May of 1992. Not sure exactly how he was able to steal 14 horses, but he was charged with that, so it was, in fact, found to be true. Troy, thankfully, was eventually apprehended by Wyoming authorities for his original charges that were brought to him in Wyoming in July of 1992, and he would be placed in a Wyoming prison. At this time, he would be sentenced to 20 to 22 years for aggravated kidnapping, as well as those assault and battery charges. However, what's really frustrating is that Troy would serve just 18 months in prison before receiving a suspended sentence, and then being moved onto 10 years of probation. Needless to say, Troy Dowd is definitely not a good person, and we will, of course, circle back to this, but for now, what you need to know is that Troy and Roy lived across the street from each other in 2006, and at the time, Troy and Roy were actually going into business together. At some point during Roy and Troy's friendship, they would agree to go into business together, selling and training roping steers. Of course, we don't know that much about Troy's background, but given Roy's background with selling and training horses, and also his background in the rodeo, this path does make sense for him. So, shortly before the events of Roy's disappearance, Roy Vavra would have sold his home. We talked about that a little bit earlier. As a result of the sale, he would give Troy, who was his business partner now, $125,000 to start the business. However, according to Anne and later reports, she would state that Roy eventually would change his mind about this decision. He would go back to Troy and ask for his $125,000 back, but Troy would eventually say that he had spent it and refused to give him that money back. However, as we'll mention again a little bit later, Troy would actually go out of his way, a few months after Roy had gone missing, to give his money back to Roy's family. Now, it's not exactly clear when this business deal was actually made. It seems there were no physical or written records of this. It seemed more of a verbal confirmation between the two of them, but it seems that this deal could have been made relatively recent to when Roy had gone missing. We do know, of course, that Roy was still living in his old home with a roommate, seemingly looking for new housing, so it seems that he had likely just sold the home, and Roy was getting increasingly distant. Could this have been caused by financial distress or concern about conflict with someone that he used to be very friendly with? We're not quite sure. Needless to say, this whole alleged business deal between both Troy and Roy made police start to be suspicious of Troy, and they would become even more suspicious when they realized that Roy's dog had started to act very odd. It was found that after Roy's disappearance, his dog would wander off of his property and go into Troy's property, laying down in the middle of Troy's riding arena. But this dog had never done that before. In addition, the dog also was digging random holes around Roy's property, another thing that this dog was not known for doing. And because of this, the Campbell County Sheriff's Office actually decided to excavate both the riding area as well as the area where the dog was digging. But unfortunately, nothing ever came of it. Shortly after this, Troy would actually leave town, making people more suspicious of him, but left with basically nothing else to do. There was no evidence against Troy, at least not anything that was more than circumstantial, or nothing that could actually lead to an arrest in the case. With that being said, after the lead of Troy Dowd, unfortunately this case once again goes cold. And it goes cold for about 4 years until Wyoming authorities get a call that they least expected. Sometime between late 2009 and early 2010, 30-year-old Jason Dwayne Larson would call from Iowa stating that he would be able to show the authorities where Roy was buried. He claimed that he had a dream that he and other men were burying Roy's body, and so because of this would be able to lead to Roy's gravesite. When Roy went missing in 2006, Jason was living in the same area as him, but was never considered a suspect. However, even though Jason's claims were pretty much outlandish, saying that he knew based off of a dream, the Campbell County Sheriff's Office decided to bite, and they would fly him out to Wyoming in order to show detectives where he believed that Roy's body was. But, of course, Jason was unable to do this. Jason had no idea what happened to Roy, alive or not, and he had no involvement in Roy's disappearance. But Jason was just an attention seeker, and unfortunately that was at the cost of Roy's name and his loved ones hoping for answers. Police also believe that Jason had made this story up in order to flee from alcohol-related charges that he was facing back in Iowa. Jason would be sentenced to 6 months in jail for his false reports and was also ordered to pay $2,000 in restitution for the financial resources that he had wasted in the process. And once again, after Jason Larson's claims, unfortunately, Roy's case goes cold. The freeze in information lasts for a decade until 2019, when Troy Dowd pops up once again. In that year, Troy would write a letter to the head of the Wyoming Division of Criminal Investigation, heavily implying that he might know some information about Roy's case. At this point, Roy's case was about 15 years old, and again was considered cold. Troy Dowd was writing this letter from his prison cell in Texas, where he was currently serving a life sentence for murder. In 2013, Troy had been found guilty in the shooting death of car dealership owner Jeffrey Sewalt. Troy had shot Jeffrey 3 times in the head over a loan. Jeff had loaned Troy $16,000, and for what we're not exactly sure, but it was agreed upon between them that Troy's truck title would be put up as collateral for the loan. However, it seems that either Troy couldn't afford to pay back the loan or just didn't want to, and as a result, he took Jeff's life. Police in Texas would find the truck title back in Troy's own home after the death of Jeff, though Troy would allege that he had actually paid Jeff back the money with interest, though no records confirm this. So after going on trial, he was found guilty of Jeff's death. So 6 years into his life sentence, Troy decided to send this very cryptic letter to the Wyoming authorities. In this letter, he never actually outright said Roy's name, but stated that he had information concerning serious felony events in northeast Wyoming. However, it wasn't like Troy just suddenly had a change of heart and wanted to clear his conscience. He wanted something in return. And that was to make a deal that in trade for his information in this alleged case happening in Wyoming, he would be transferred to a Wyoming prison. Troy, of course, wanted to be transferred to the Wyoming prison first before he would talk, but investigators would not let that happen. Instead, an investigator was flown out to Texas in order to speak with both Troy and his attorney at the time. Though this lead, again, would not result in anything substantial. No deal was made, and no information could really be gotten about what had happened to Roy. Again, Troy remained very cryptic in the way he was speaking to the investigator. This investigator would say that he left the interview feeling fairly certain that Troy had some type of involvement with Roy's case, but unfortunately there was just no evidence as of right now to draw it back to him. Troy has made no confessions or statements since about his involvement with Roy's case or anyone else's case, and to this day he refuses to talk to the media, even though there have been several outlets trying to get his statement. And with that pretty much takes us to the theories in this case. For me, I think that there's really 3 main theories to touch on. Again, if you've watched my videos before, you know that I like to discuss theories from my personal least believed theory to the most believed. So I'm going to start, of course, with my least believed theory. Theory number 1 for me is that a partner of someone that Roy was romantically involved with somehow had killed him or done something to make him disappear in some way. This theory, I think, does make sense, but is, to me, the least believable in these set of 3 theories due to the fact that we really just don't have any evidence. Now, we know that Roy was known to be a ladies' man, often blurring the lines of friendship and romantics, but again, we don't really know if there was any current romantic involvement with him between anyone else going on at the time of his disappearance. While it's not uncommon, unfortunately, for partners to be enraged at a cheating partner and then doing something to harm the person that they were cheating with, we just don't really have any information to speculate much on this theory. I think this theory could have some validity, but that's really just up to background investigations going on, and we can't really point to anyone specifically. Theory number 2 is that what happened to Roy was a result of a serial killer. Now, this may seem more far-fetched than the first one, but there is some interesting information that I was able to find out about other cases that happened near Roy, or other cases that happened that seemed very similar to what happened with Roy, even if it wasn't exactly near him. The first case is the case of Kenneth Carlisle. He was 25 years old at the time that he went missing on August 2nd of 2005 in Gillette, Wyoming, which is where we know that Roy had gone missing from. Kenneth was actually missing for a full 6 years before his body was found on October 1st of 2011 in a wooded area by a hunter. Now, it's not exactly known whether authorities believed Kenneth's case to be either self-inflicted or accidental or some type of criminal matter, but we do know that it's kind of weird for 2 men to go missing within the span of 6 months in the exact same area. However, there is another case that some people, including the media and now a sergeant that's re-looking into the case, believe could be involved with Roy's case. This is the case of Leonard Derrickson. Leonard was just 39 years old when he went missing from his home in Strong City, Oklahoma. On the morning of March 13th, 1998, Leonard and his son were sitting at the breakfast table enjoying breakfast together. At some point in that morning, though, while they were enjoying breakfast, someone would pull up into their driveway with a white pickup truck. An unknown man would knock on the front door, and Leonard would answer. When he answered, the unknown man would state that he was interested in buying one of Leonard's stud horses for sale and asked if he could go see them. Leonard left with that man that day, telling his son that he was taking him to Mobeetie, Texas, in order to show him the horse, though he would be back later that day. However, Leonard never returned. Of course, given the white pickup truck, some people did draw some similarities between the case of Roy and Leonard. Now, we do know that this case took place in Oklahoma, which is 2 states or over 12 hours away from Wyoming, but because of the similarities, some people have pieced them together. This included a journalist who spoke with the Campbell County Sheriff's Office, and the Sergeant Sams, who reopened the case recently, agreed that he would look into any similarities between the two men's cases. He agreed that the similarities are quite suspicious, so it would be worth taking a look into it, especially for both of these cases being considered cold. Of course, neither Leonard or Roy have been found, either dead or alive, but it does make some people believe that some harm could have been done to them, and as a result, the serial killer theory kind of came up. Another thing that's worth taking a look into when comparing the similarities of Leonard and Roy's cases is the sketch that was made in the case of Leonard Derrickson. It's been said by a few people that the sketch made of the person who came to the front door that day looks very similar to Troy Dowd. I'll have pictures of both the sketch and Troy on screen, but to me, I can't lie, there definitely are some similarities. Especially when you look into the eyebrows and the nose area. I think that makes them look the most similar. With that being said, though, that now takes us into our last theory, theory number 3. Theory number 3 is that Troy was involved in Roy's disappearance, possibly killing him. This theory, again, I really believe is the most believable. Now, of course, I have to say that everything that I tell you is alleged. Troy has never been formally charged or convicted of any crime, but when you really take a look at the facts of this case, Troy is quite suspicious. The first thing that we need to look into in Troy's possible motive is the business agreement with Roy. We know that this deal was shady at best, with really no physical records of the agreement. But whenever financial things come up to play, a lot of people can get very heated, and it's often cause for violence, unfortunately. When it comes to Troy specifically, we know for a fact that he has definitely been violent as a result of a financial motive, especially since he was convicted of the murder of Jeffrey Sewalt after not being able to pay or not wanting to pay a loan back. We know that Roy for sure was frustrated and wanted his money back, and that would have certainly caused conflict, especially for two people who lived right across the street from each other. This conflict certainly could have caused tension and heightened into something that eventually resulted in Troy harming or killing Roy. In addition, Troy not only was known to be physically violent in the past in the case of his ex-wife, but he also would go on to be violent in the future in the case of killing Jeffrey Sewalt. So is it that hard to believe that he could have hurt or killed someone if he believed that he had the right motive? I also want to go back to the mention of that case that happened in Florida where he was charged with stealing 14 quarter horses. I think that that's another thing that really should be brought up because I'm assuming that how he had stolen these horses was part of a scamming scheme. He likely would have promised the woman as payment, maybe taken the horses first and promised to repay her, and this seems eerily similar to what would have happened between Troy and Roy. Troy promised to make some profit off of the money that Roy had given him, but when Roy never saw that profit, he wanted the money back. I also really do think that something very interesting in this case is the fact that Troy had repaid Roy's family months after his disappearance the money that Roy had originally given him. Now, if Troy really couldn't pay Roy back and said that he had spent the money, where did he come up with this money? Did he actually have it but didn't want to give it, but then felt guilty for some reason because of his involvement with Roy's disappearance? We just don't know, but I think that that money means something to him. I do think that it's probably a result of guilt that he decided to give that money back to Roy's family. He would have known that that family would have needed it in the search for Roy. My last little tidbit in the Troy theory is that I think it's so suspicious that Troy would have reached out during his time in prison. At the time, this case was still cold. Nobody was actively looking into it, again, like they are now. But why would Troy have chosen to do so? It seems like he could have been fabricating the information that he had, but he really did want to be transferred to that prison. So it seems that Troy, at least in some regard, believed that he had information pertaining to some type of criminal case, likely Roy's case. Also, if we do think that somehow Troy is the serial killer, like in my second theory, it could be possible that if he had involvement with the Kenneth or Leonard case, that's why he was so cryptic in the letter that he wrote to Wyoming authorities from his prison cell in Texas. He did state, quote, serious felony offenses in Northeast Wyoming. To me, that kind of insinuates that he might have information on several things that happened. Again, this just remains a theory, but I think the Troy theory is definitely something to think about, and hopefully we'll get some answers on that soon. With all that being said, we can theorize all day about this case, but at the end of the day, it does remain unsolved. Sams has said that he has been re-investigating and re-interviewing several people, and at this point in time, at least as of the beginning of last month in March, he did state that he has 4 suspects, and one of them being Troy Dowd. Hopefully soon there will be some evidence and answers. With all that being said, let me remind you of how you might be able to identify Roy Vavra. Being able to identify him and remember what he had looked like at the time could help jog someone's memory. Roy was 38 years old and living in Gillette, Wyoming, as of his disappearance on January 24th, 2006. He was a white male with brown hair and blue eyes. He was 6 foot and 190 pounds at the time that he had gone missing. Roy had a scar on his knee as well as his abdomen. Roy is described in some sources as balding and having yellow teeth, and according to one source, he did have a vasectomy scar, though I wasn't able to actually parse out how accurate this was. So I'm not fully certain if that scar is actually there. At the time of Roy's disappearance, he was known to be wearing the following. He was wearing a light gray sweatshirt with Marsh Memorial printed on the left chest, Wrangler brand jeans, a black hat with classic ropes written on it, a brown leather Western style belt with rawhide accents, a silver Western belt buckle with the phrase Team Ropers on it, and brown and black cowboy boots. Roy was also wearing a hemp braided necklace with a bear tooth, and could have possibly been wearing a rawhide bracelet at the time, though it's not entirely certain. If you or anyone you know has any information about Roy Vavra's case, please reach out to the proper authorities. Their information is on screen right now, as well as in the description box as always. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to Roy Vavra's case. He was just 38 years old at the time that he went missing in 2006. To this day, his family and friends still continue to look for him and hope to get some answers as to what happened. And I really do hope that soon there will be some answers, especially given the reinvestigation and reopening of his case. Hopefully the fresh eyes from Sergeant Sams will help to bring some answers. With all that being said, that's all for me today, but if you like this video, please don't hesitate to like, subscribe, comment, and share this video. Again, my name is Brianna, and thank you so much for joining me on this episode of Vanished Memories.